welcome to the Sweet Science of Fighting podcast. Today we have a duo. We have Dr. John Babraj, who was a first-time guest, and we have Andrew Usher returning as a second-timer. So I think this is the second-timer guest now. We had John Mackey on the other week. So let's maybe start with a little bit of your background. Let's start with you, John. Just a little bit of your background there. We'll jump into Andrew's background and we'll go straight into it.
My name's John. I'm an exercise physiologist. I did my PhD in skeletal muscle protein metabolism a very long time ago now, back in 2000, under Mike Rennie, looking at nutrition and exercise as a stimulator for metabolic response in muscle, tendon, and bone. Since then, I have gone on to work in sports science, working on really trying to find efficient ways to train. So a lot of my work is focused on sprint interval training, which is short and sharp, so it allows a lot more time for technical, tactical work.
Nice. And you, Andrew, I guess you've both been applying a lot of this research into the professional boxing world, correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm obviously Andrew, so I'm an exercise physiologist.
Yep.
Yeah, so obviously Andrew, exercise physiologist, I guess, performance specialist for a lot of boxers, ranging from early start career boxers right through to world champion level. Obviously do my PhD at Abertay University and John is my supervisor, which is why he's dragged into all this stuff. Where we're looking at, so we're kind of, the PhD's predominantly been looking at using NIRS and near-infrared spectroscopy to look at the skeletal muscle response and different training adaptations within professional boxing. So we're covering a wide range of areas, looking at everything from recovery modeling to how oxygen is utilized within the muscle, how it's repeated effort is sustained, how that affects kind of oxygenation and resaturation values, and a whole heap of that. The big benefit for me is I'm obviously a boxing coach, so I coach. So unlike a lot of other researchers, I actually do the job. So for me, it's really about bridging the gap between theoretical research and actually applying it in a real-time context.
Yeah, and obviously that's a big one within all sports. But I wanted to dive into high-intensity training, and I think now we have a very strong shift. It's been a little while towards this idea of zone 2 conditioning or low-intensity conditioning. That's kind of been the big trend within, I guess, the past year or so in terms of aerobic conditioning. And I see within high intensity training, it's almost like the opposite approach. So maybe let's dive into, John, do you want to maybe go into what HIT is and then what you're trying to achieve out of it?
Okay. It's pretty much like you say, it's the opposite approach to zone 2 low intensity training. The advantage it has is it's short and sharp. So we're not asking athletes to train for an hour, 2 hours at a set intensity. From my point of view, that leads to increased training load and risk of injury. So what HIT is all out effort. I don't use so lots of people have used it as 100% peak power or 90% maximum heart rate. I don't do that. What we tend to do is ask people to go as hard as they can. So it's a maximal or super maximal effort that we're looking for, but for a very short period of time. Typically between 6 seconds to maximally no more than, if it's as a training protocol, I probably don't use more than 20-second interval. And then you have the recovery period between, and you ask people to do it again and again and again for so many. What we've found is around about a minute is around about the ideal duration.
Gotcha. Andrew, could you just mute your mic a little? I think there must be some feedback coming through. So not your mic, your speaker there. I think there might be some feedback coming through there. I'm not entirely sure what's happening. You can just press the mute one there. Oh yeah, either that works. Okay, so the high intensity approach, I think what's interesting within this approach is the idea that, okay, if you look at the research that you've published there, and then you look at, for example, like the Tabata study, you see similarities where, okay, VO2 max kind of peaks around 2-3 weeks. But what was interesting with your study is even when you can continue through 9 weeks, you still see improvements in endurance performance, just not in VO2 max. You see time to exhaustion improve and things like
Yeah.
that. So I guess the question becomes, how important is VO2 max in terms of overall, I guess, sports performance? And then is there a threshold maybe that, okay, you hit, does it really matter if it goes up more? Are there what other things are then factors in terms of improving conditioning?
Yeah, so VO2 max is obviously viewed as the gold standard measure of endurance capacity of an athlete. And to some extent, that's not right. It represents a central ability to deliver oxygen, and it's limited centrally. And that's why people
Okay.
with low VO2 max can still perform to a super high level. There's a genetic component to it as well that limits how high somebody's VO2 max can go, but it doesn't limit their ability to perform at the elite level. And as a performance indicator, VO2 max is very poor. It's not the obvious thing you'd think it would be related to is marathon performance, and there's absolutely no correlation between VO2 max and marathon performance. So what was the important part about what you were saying there was the second part, that time to complete the test. So if we think about it, the VO2 max is really about how much oxygen is coming in, how much carbon dioxide is coming in, how much oxygen you're taking in.
Yeah.
That time to exhaustion is much more reflective of what the muscles are doing. So it's a much better indicator of muscular endurance. So how well the muscle's able to work under distress. And for me, that's the most important part of any VO2 max test, is that time to exhaustion. How long does it take you to get to a point where you can no longer create enough energy to continue at the speed or the power that we're asking you to?
Gotcha. So if we were going to really try to dumb this down, we could say that this high intensity or sprint interval training, we're looking at almost targeting peripheral adaptations within the muscle, and the central adaptations are kind of maxed out within a few weeks when doing these protocols.
Yeah. So VO2 max seems to hit a plateau. So if you don't change your protocol, VO2 max within a few weeks is your body is now comfortably delivering sufficient oxygen.
Gotcha.
But the muscle is still under distress and is still adapting. So even after 9 weeks, I don't think with a 9-week protocol we've reached saturation point in the muscle.
So does that mean then that you would deem these muscular adaptations more important than, say, heart or central adaptations in terms of overall conditioning?
Yes. For me,
Okay.
performance comes from the muscle. Performance is movement. All we're doing when we're performing sport is asking somebody to move in a specific way, whether that's football, boxing, sanda, any sort of sport. There's a sequence of movements we want the muscle to be able to make. And if the muscle hasn't got the conditioning to do it, it's irrelevant what centrally you're delivering.
Interesting. Okay. This is starting to plug some gaps in my brain. I'm really liking this. Andrew, I want you to jump in here around the sprint protocols you guys have developed as well. Obviously, John mentioned about, after 3 weeks, VO2 max may not change, but you're changing protocols semi-often because you're looking at changes in how heart rate recovers and how heart rate raises during exercise. So maybe dive into a few of those sprint protocols and kind of how you've come across those and how you use them.
So I think the first big issue is that people are just doing sprint training for the sake of sprint training, because they kind of think they've adapted some alactic lactic kind of process without actually really trying to ascertain what the underlying physiology is doing. So when we do sprint training, everything is based upon the athlete and the response to the athlete. So obviously, if you're in the lucky position that we're in, where you've got polar H10 and MOXIE sensors, we're able to see central and peripheral delivery and have a good idea of how that's changing through sprints. For those that don't have that, they just have a heart rate, then obviously we are grabbing that heart rate data and then running some math formulas and algorithms to determine how the heart rate's recovering. because there's a lot more to it than just, you peak at 180 and you recover at 160 in 23 seconds. So there's a lot more to actually how that recovery actually occurs and how the slow and fast phase occurs. So, so when we're working with athletes, what's happening is that sprints are changed per week based upon the week's training loads and the response that we're seeing in the physiology. So we can always maintain and kind of change and create adaptations at all times. And I think this is the key of what we actually do versus your generic MMA workout that you see where it's just, because the thing is physiology is a lot more complicated than we think. And even when it comes to like peak heart rate values, we know that athletes get to peak heart rate very quick. The on kinetics is pretty fast. The recovery is the area that we seem to get trapped into this. We're going to measure it just solely on heart rate beats that are recovered. But there's a lot more taking place than that. And to get the best out of it, you need to really understand that and have a look at things like exponential curve fit and linear regression models. And these are the things that nobody wants to do because they're horrible. You need to have some math knowledge. Yeah, you need to have some knowledge of it, but you can't just throw out somebody on like a 15 on 30 off protocol without understanding why you're actually doing it. We inherit a lot of athletes into the lab that's what they're on. And you get these wonderful, kind of explanation as to why they're on it, which is rooted in no physiology whatsoever. So for us, it's quite straightforward. Assess, test, see where athletes at, and then devise your protocols around about what you're trying to achieve. Obviously, for some boxers that could be impulse driven, that we need to see them kind of move a bit quicker out the corner. For others, it may be the recovery is exceptionally poor, and we need to, kind of make them recover better between the rest rounds. So there's a whole myriad of reasons of why you're doing it. It's not the cookie cutter approach that a lot of these conditioning websites are trying to tell you what it is. And I think this is one of the big issues and why conditioning has never really moved further forward in the last 10 years is we're obsessed with simplicity. And I think, I think simplicity for general population things is probably quite good, but elite athlete level, it's got no place for me. It has to be done properly.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that helps or not. So that kind of more or less says there is no protocol. There is standard protocols. Obviously, the first couple of weeks with any new athlete, we probably put them on a classic Wingate protocol. We'll give them, 2 30-second all-out sprints, 60-second recoveries. If I'm working remotely with someone and I can't get anything else, that's a good benchmark for me. If they can come in and see me, then I can probably take a week's worth of Wingates and really run everything I need to run mathematically and sciencey wise to then the following week's give them different protocols.
A week of Wingates, like every day?
No, like just 2 or 3 a week.
No, I was like, damn.
But I mean, good. And then there's the other big issue that nobody addresses, and this is something me and John have been looking at quite a lot, is what load should you have when you do a Wingate? Is 7.5% a reasonable, body weight percentage on the flywheel? We've got a student, postgrad student Callum is doing 8.5%. He's looking at 7.5 and 8.5. For Hannah Rankin's last camp, we had her on 9.5%, and she was doing 9.5%, and she was doing 15 on, or was it? I can't remember. We had her in a mix, but she was like either 15 on 10 off or 10 on 15 for 10 at 9.5%, and she was clocking out over 1,000 watts. Not as much as John, because John's like a machine. And my old thing that everyone says to me is, and I've said this time and again, nobody's died in the labs yet. And the reason I say that is because in the world of conditioning, there seems to be this fear that the heart's going to explode and people are going to mutate into all sorts of things. And the reality is most athletes do not train hard enough when it comes to conditioning. And that's because we are propagated with this world of, I'm going to be political today, of zone 2 training. And making people spend.
Bring out your cunty side, Andrew. I've been thinking it's going to come out today. I'm pretty sure your reply to me yesterday was sarcastic, and I was like, he must be in a cunty mood yesterday, so he's probably going to be in one today too.
So zone 2 is a great thing for deconditioned athletes, people coming out of cardiac rehab, general populations. I have no issue with kind of that idea of cardiac output, left ventricle development, etc. But the world of elite athletes is fucking bullshit. Especially in high intensity based acyclic sports, there's no room for this. It's too much time out your training schedule. You're not getting bang for buck, but we're still propagating. I'm still seeing people heavily pushing zone 2 training and lactate threshold monitoring. I'm just like, why? When we can get the adaptations quicker and allow people to be doing more skill. we are, as sports scientists, we are still very, very big on the boxers need to box, kickboxers need to kickbox. That is the
Yeah.
fundamental thing. You can have the best VO2 max on the planet. You can have the best desaturation and resaturation on the planet, but can't box. It doesn't matter.
Hmm.
So the reality is sports science is an adjunct to the skill set, but the skill set needs to be trained. That first and foremost for us is
Yeah.
boxers need to box, period. So the more we can support that through proper sports science for recovery modeling, more power output, acceleration, that's what we should be using sports science and strength conditioning to do. We shouldn't be doing it to put some kid on a bike for 4 hours a day, 3 times a week. Which is just insane.
That I'm with you on the sports side for sure. I'm moving away from this idea of okay, a lot of low intensity, etc., etc. I think a lot of people who came into strength conditioning, coaching, maybe came from a strength background or within university, you don't get taught a lot of application of conditioning. And I think you find it online and you find the prominent stuff, and a lot of it is around this idea, the ideas you mentioned, cardiac output, left ventricle, eccentric hypertrophy, hey, bigger heart chamber, pump more blood, more central adaptations, and then your higher intensity for better peripheral adaptations and stuff. But what you guys are doing, I think, is really, really interesting, goes right against the grain. I love it.
I
Makes me
think,
rethink everything that I'm also doing too.
I think one of the detractors from what I do is this whole idea of central and systemic is so important because, without it, your peripheral doesn't get, fuel distributed. And I'm like, yeah, well, that's true. Systemic is important, but, I can put you in the ring and amputate both your legs. You're still technically boxing, but you just don't have any delivery mechanism to strike. So,
Mm.
systemic and the peripheral's a bit like that. Systemic can deliver, but the big burning underlying question that we're finding in the research is how good is the peripheral side of actually uptaking that oxygen
Mm.
to deliver it to the muscle in order to allow sustained effort.
I think we oversimplify blood flow as well.
Yeah.
People think heart rate goes up, blood flow's gone up, all's good. So the muscle must be getting enough oxygen. That's not true, because we get into this world of microcirculation, which is completely different from systemic arterial and venous flow. So heart rate can go up about 5-fold during exercise. Microcirculation blood flow can go up about 100-fold. So there's an extra pump around the muscle that's allowing faster flow and faster extraction. That's separate from what the heart's doing.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I think we
That's the idea around your
oversimplify.
peripheral adaptations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we oversimplify blood flow.
And then we get this whole idea that when the blood
Okay.
arrives down and you kind of go down to the capillary bed and you hit into the arterial and you've then got to get that kind of hemoglobin and myoglobin utilized, and it's going to be extracted and transferred across to the mitochondria, and the mitochondria needs oxygen, and et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole cellular response going on, but there's potential limiting factors in, diffusion and how much can you actually pass through the arterial the capillary bed to the muscle. There's a whole heap of things taking place at the microvascular and cellular level that we still don't actually understand. I mean, muscle physiology, we know a lot, obviously, about type 1, type 2 muscle fibers, recruitment, kind of myosin actin crossover, all that type of stuff. But when you get to the microvascular world and you look at how the muscles actually extracting and utilizing blood as nutrient availability, etc., it's still pretty limited, especially in sport. And the other big thing with the research papers, there's been a lot of work with Kevin McCulley and all these papers that like looking at, models of mitochondrial capacity and all this thing. It's all with partially fatigued muscle. It's not with fully fatigued muscle. And I think probably our lab's one of the only ones that's really looking at fully fatigued athletes and what that mitochondrial response really looks like and how that recovery takes place. And I can tell you that is one messy world because it's not as straightforward as people believe. It's a lot more complicated, and it's giving us headaches. And I would reckon that we're pretty switched on it, but it's kind of like it's still giving us headaches as to why certain things are occurring, because and then you have other interesting issues like, for example, the left quad, the right quad may extract and utilize oxygen at different time points. So there's no real symmetry. It's a very asymmetrical system. It's not working and then we find things like a boxer may throw say within the first 6, 7, 8 punches, but may only desaturate by 3%, and another one may desaturate by 5%. It's such an individualistic thing how the body utilizes physiology that the cookie cutter approach, it doesn't cut it at elite level anymore. You need to have a really good understanding of why you're doing something first and foremost, and what you're expecting to get out of it. So it's pretty complex. It's super fascinating. I mean, we're getting phenomenal results, but it's taken a long time to get there, and it's taken a lot of young athletes to be suffered through training protocols to get there. But but I mean, we are. John and I are not very media friendly, and we don't really do a lot of publicizing what we're doing. Right, we're like two hidden trolls in a basement. But the last year has been phenomenal for us. We've taken kids to national titles, we've had world champions, we've had WBC champions. We're just losing count how many of these kids are winning stuff now. And it's just because their conditioning is so good. It's when you actually look at it, we start to see that strength is probably less important than conditioning in the world of combat sports. In boxing, it's slightly obviously different than BJJ and MMA. There's a high component and the ability to push and press, and kind of, anyone, that old adage when you do BJJ that, technically you'll take everyone out. It's not the same when you're 9 stone, you've got a 16 stone guy kind of, pennies out. It's like then you realise that
just pancaking
you actually realise maybe that was a lot of bullshit there. At that point, strength and push and kind of being able to kind of shrimp and get out is more important. So everything is sport specific, but we see that it's much more complicated than probably people realise. And if the muscle isn't extracting oxygen and utilising it at a reasonable rate, then it doesn't matter how good your system, it doesn't matter how good your kind of central delivery is, which is the big thing that probably ups me a lot.
Yeah. I mean, that's the big thing being pushed, obviously, that central delivery. But to maybe go into or bring it back to or away from the elite athlete side, because I think a lot of people listen to this may not be at that level, and maybe they're looking at, I don't know, national, regional, state in their city, local competitions and things like that. Is this an approach? Say someone maybe isn't well trained, doesn't have a good conditioning background, doesn't have a large training background. Would this be something you would throw someone in? Is this a time and place you would still do high intensity training? Or is there a time and place where you wouldn't use this kind of training and opt for lower intensity style training to, I don't know, eke out benefits that are easier to train for, essentially, in terms of effort?
For me, no, because even for sub-elite athletes, you're going into a competition against somebody. So if you're fighting regional, you'll be fighting against somebody else. Chances are you're probably working as well. So you're holding down some sort of job. How can you give the time to condition properly if you're going low intensity where you're having to do a 2-hour session, plus develop technical and tactical skills required, or the ring craft required for a sport? You're not going to be able to marry it up and have some sort of family life, social life that everyone wants as well. So this approach, even for non-elite athletes, is exactly the same. You get out what you put in. The harder you push, the more you'll get out, because you're going to create more stress in the body to change. But you can do it quickly. That's the benefit.
Gotcha.
You can do it in a 10-minute session. At the end of technical spar, for example, you could put in a 10-minute session at the end and get your conditioning adaptation.
Oh, Andrew, I think you're muted. Hang on.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're good.
I think Gary spoke about this when he was on the podcast with Team GB and the GB boxers, that, after discussing a lot with them, they have, slide in bike sprints after spar sessions, and, because you get great flexibility with it. It's one of the benefits of this type of training is, but it's great. The other thing about it is that even general population, it's great, because you've got to remember that your supramaximal effort is linked to how fit you are and how able you are. So as long as you're pushing as hard as you can push, you're going to get something out of it. So we always tell to athletes that sessions will never get easier, because you only push as hard as you can push, right? So you're kind of constantly chasing yourself.
If you can push harder.
Yeah, so for someone that's maybe really deconditioned, come out of surgery, and they're kind of, they've been through the rehab and their prehab, and they're through it, and they're back doing work, that intensity level for them may only be 10% of the intensity level of someone else, but it will still be enough to start, creating physiological change. And it always goes back for us to the physiology of muscle and adaptations and things, because you've got this thing as well about sarcopenia and muscle loss. And there's a big question in our mind about, could you offset that with increasing mitochondrial function? So there's a whole heap of interesting areas around about why we do things. But there's always a place for, I think there's always a place for something high intensity. So I think, I think it doesn't matter what level
I
you're
think
at.
perhaps the term high intensity scares people.
Yeah.
It has connotations of I don't know, CrossFit or something like that, where people are smashing things. And
John was never going to speak nice, so that's not speaking nice.
but we do high intensity with 75, 80-year-olds. They can still do high intensity. The intensity, the power we're producing is not what Hannah's producing on the bike.
Yeah.
And we wouldn't expect it to be. But it's enough to create adaptation in the muscle to allow them to go about their activities. So with older people, we're trying to get something different out. We're not trying to make them elite athletes. We're trying to just make life easier. Stop that loss of functional decline. And we can do it with high intensity training. 10 minutes once a week, twice a week is more than enough. But it's very high intensity. It's an individual thing.
Is the bike the only way you guys like to do the high intensity training, or are there other modalities that you typically use as well?
I like the bike because it requires no skill. You can't really pace it. And then you get the adaptations, but you can do it other ways, such as uphill sprinting. We've got some data, like sand dune sprinting. We'll do similar things where you've got a soft surface, so when you push the force in, you've got to actually really generate force back out. Are they as good as this bike? No, because you lose control. And it's easier for people to step back, go, this is hard, so I'm not actually going to push as hard as I want. So for me, the bike is the best way to do it, and I'd always do it on a bike over anything else.
You mean?
But there are other ways to do it.
Yeah, I mean, we'll do targeted bag sessions. I mean, I'm a big lover of making the bag sessions very interval based. If I had a bike, I would do the bike. I mean, you can kind of do them on the assault bike. A lot of my amateurs, that's all they have access to is an assault bike, so we do sprints on them. I'd stay away from the concept to rower. I'm just not a lover of it. I think it takes a bit of coordination, so it takes away that full ability to go really super maximal on it. Bags, I'm just to clarify this, because I think people just think I spend my life with athletes in high intensity. We don't. There's a whole heap of other things that we do as well. I mean, it's not just high intensity training, but the reason we do the high intensity is it's easy to slide in, but it's also a phenomenal benchmark. Like if you're consistently, for example, I'd be very lucky that I've worked with the UK Special Forces on occasion, and we do some crazy stuff with them, and like, how quick can you get to 5 miles on the assault bike? And these lads can get 5 miles pretty fast. And I've got my amateurs pretty close on the tail of them at the moment. So we'll do a whole heap of things. But the reason the bike is very useful is, as John said, it's a standardized protocol. Everyone can do it, but it's a benchmark even with an assault bike. If you ever get a kid hitting a mile in just under 2 minutes on a Monday, and then the following Monday they're at 2 minutes 25, and then the next week they're at 2 minutes 27, something's actually occurring there that you can track and trace, and that's really important. But the other thing I'm going to say is about sprints, bikes, and wing gates is the research has been very, very neglectful of what's actually taking place in wing gates. There's a massive amount of data that we have started to extrapolate out that never gets published, like left leg or right leg symmetry, time to peak power, how long that peak power has been held, what the duration of peak power is, when the decline occurs, when the minimal power occurs. Because we started to see some really interesting correlations to time to peak power in relation to time to explosive power within the ring, and how quick can someone actually maximally produce power and push off the back foot. And that was kind of instrumental in Hannah's last camp. We spent a lot of time looking at metrics like that on the bike, like how quick was she getting to 1,000 watts, how long was she holding 1,000 watts, what was the muscle doing during that period, and then having the benefit of having her in sparring with a Moxie on and having a look at when is she reaching, peak combination values, hand speed values, and then correlate it all together. You start to see there's some interesting phenomena around the muscle and how it actually utilizes oxygen and how it produces force.
Before getting back to the podcast, I want to let you know there's a link down in the description for the Swedes Art of Fighting underground community. You can get all the help you need for your combat sports training. You get every single Swedes Art of Fighting training program, online course, and you get access to a range of coaches within the private Discord community. So go check that out, and back to the podcast.
And the bike.
So you're using like bike sprints almost as a way as like rate of force or rate of power development, like you would in a gym, but you're doing it on a bike base.
Yeah, we track everything. So I mean, we are at the moment. I'm actually, for my sins, because John had me doing it. We're looking at rate of force development, for the next paper. We've been using the isokinetic chair, and that's been pretty fascinating because it's too early yet to say, but peak power is higher on arms than it is in legs in pro boxers, but yet the rate of force development seems to be higher in the legs than it is. So the time to rate of force development at the moment seems to be slightly higher for the couple I've run, or just run the dates early days. But there's some interesting, when you compare it to them, when the muscle starts to desaturate, you start to see some very interesting things. When the muscle hits like peak metabolic stress and it has to desaturate because it has to extrapolate oxygen, I'm getting excited. That is a magical moment because we see it in sprints, I see it in sparring, I see it in bag sessions, and I see it in pad sessions. There is like I think in our sparring data or a research paper, it's a peer review. I think it's about between 4 and 6 seconds. I'm John, but when the muscle starts to desaturate, and and those athletes that are not conditioned particularly well have longer times or shorter times depending. And the recovery within the end round. In fact, what we're actually hoping to propose when we get this bloody thing published is it will be the first ever model of physiology within sparring of a physiological peripheral muscle activity, which is quite exciting. So there is a lot of interesting things you can get from things like a load bike, from a Wingate, a Monarch bike, that people are overlooking because the research papers are obsessed with peak values, but they're not interested in how long does it take you to get there, and how long can you hold it for? And what's what's the heart rate at that point? What's the heart rate drop off? How does heart rate versus desaturation? So there's a whole heap of exciting things, but not everyone wants to go to that level. That's the other thing.
Well, with that holding peak power, would that be almost how well you can tolerate workload while basically having a high oxygen desaturation in the muscle? So you're basically operating at low levels of oxygen, or is it more so that it's a less steep decline in oxygen desaturation as you're holding that peak power?
So we're looking for sustained effort, and we're looking to repeat sustained effort through recovery. And what you're trying to find is when you reach peak power and the muscle desaturates, there will be a point, but the muscle kind of goes into, and John can probably speak about this, goes into more like, it's not a steady state because one of our peer reviewers didn't like that term. Homeostasis, like the muscle will try to get into some kind of form of equilibrium to be able to function, unless it's completely fatigued. In which case, if the muscle is completely fatigued and you see SMO2 drops to 0, then that we know from incremental treadmill tests and sprints, the athlete is done. If you were to hit peak power, it would depend. Most people are not holding it for that long in the sprints, are they, John? Like a few seconds, maybe 2 or 3.
Yeah. So on the sprints, if I remember the data correctly, peak power is occurring before desaturation.
Just slightly, yeah, because there's a slight delay in how the muscle is kind of catching on. Yeah, it's a bit like heart rate. You see, as you do your sprint, your heart rate slightly, your peak's slightly further on when you actually hit that peak value. The muscle is kind of the same. There is a physiological. If you think about it, the time it takes to go through desaturation, diffusion gradients, and all that stuff. But you definitely, with like a Moxie or a Portamon or any of those gadgets, you see some quite interesting things that when the muscle is fully fatigued, when the athlete, when the athlete has maybe believes they're fatigued, but they're not. No. We had a kid in a boxer do an incremental treadmill test. And when we start with the protocol at 10, we go up to 18 kilometers, and then we just go up gradients at that point at 18. And this kid got to 18 and 12, so he's running 18 kilometers an hour. So he's already done, he's eight minutes of that, then he's right up to 12 on the incline. And the kid's whole oxygenation just bottomed out. He was like 0. And he still ran for what, about 72 seconds or something before he came off. I mean, he couldn't move after it, but it was an amazing example. When you hit the wall, and he goes through the wall, and then it's like there's another wall, and he kind of went through the next wall, and then he just had to stop. And the fascinating thing about that was that the more fatigued these athletes seem to get, the better the resaturation value seems to be in the rebound, which is something I'm looking at just now. So
Interesting.
so I think, and I can't show at this stage because it's too early, but I believe there is something to training to that point of fatigue from a physiological response mechanism. But I don't think many people train to that level of fatigue.
Well, it kind of goes into the I guess the fatigue theory models, right? Like central governor model and things like that. You know, can you train the brain to essentially not switch you off once you get to those levels? And I guess hitting those super maximal efforts and hitting those walls over and over potentially desensitizes you to it, maybe. I'm not
I
sure. I'm
think
just kind of
it's
spitballing
the
and
other way
maybe talking
around,
shit here.
James. It's can you train the
Other way around.
muscle not to switch your brain off, to switch off drive.
Oh, okay.
So if you think about it, the muscle feeds back through type 3-4 afferents what's going on to the brain. So at the point of fatigue, the muscle's under high metabolic stress or high stress load. And type 3-4 afferents will be highly firing, highly charging. So they'll be switching off the actual central drive. So it's not really centrally driven. It's actually peripherally driven. So what you want to do is to train to stop the activation of type 3-4 afferents before you're truly in metabolic distress.
Okay. So everything comes back to the muscle again. This is
I mean,
this is really I like
it's
this.
interesting because, you know, before I started working with John with the PhD, my big interest in combat sports was basically substrate utilization. I was quite obsessed with this whole idea of, you know, if we can utilize portable cosmeds, etc. You know, what were we actually seeing? You know, what is the substrate, etc., etc. And it was at that time I had quite a lot of moxies because I've been using them for a few years. But it was at that point you realised that you just see what you'd expect to see. You know, intensity creates a change in substrate utilization. And centrally you see peak VO2 values. So the harder the train, the more you see that number goes up and the more the heart rate goes up. And it was quite, from a PhD point of view, you realise it's junk because it's not really giving you anything that's novel, unique, or, you know, and it's been, and you see it in the amateur papers, there's been simulated boxing, there's been all heap of things. And we know in these amateur papers that VO2 ranges from the low end, you know, 40, probably actually from 30 upwards.
All the way up to like triathlon level in some of the papers from some of
But then when you bring in like world class undisputed champions and you throw them on these things, you suddenly realise that some of the worst VO2 scores on the planet. But they're undisputed world champions, right? Now I seen something on Instagram yesterday, somebody going on about VO2 max being the gold standard with Taekwondo athletes. And you know, and you need to have a good aerobic capacity, blah blah blah. And I'm just thinking you don't understand physiology because you don't need to have the most amazing VO2 max score. You need to have reasonable VO2. I mean, 40s upwards is probably okay. But you don't need to have a triathletes or a marathoners run a VO2 max score because that's not the sport. So for me, so for me, it had to be something else is occurring that's probably limiting. And that's when I noticed when I was looking at all my substrate and I was looking at all my VO2 data that the muscle was doing something completely different. And despite the fact we're in a totally carbohydrate, you know, value and we're above 1 in our RVR and all that good stuff, you know, and in an anaerobic state and all this stuff, that actually oxygen was relatively quite present within the muscle tissue. So you start thinking to yourself,
actually reminds me. No, I was going to say I went down the high volume power training rabbit hole the other day. I did a bit of it last year myself, and it reminded me exactly of your sprint protocols because they also mentioned in there about bike sprints as well, and this idea that like most of the repeat high intensity efforts are different to repeat sprint ability, and they go into kind of the details around the idea that okay, repeat sprint ability, yeah, sure, you can have a decent aerobic capacity to recover, but it seems the limit, I think one paper had it as like an MAS score of around 4.7 meters per second. And then outside of that, the repeat sprint ability doesn't really relate well to repeat high intensity efforts when you have to tackle and actually do something in terms of that has a high strength value in there. And it's interesting that you mentioned around just the idea of the muscular work that needs to be done. And I wanted to ask as well around the peripheral adaptations, because a lot of it we read and get taught as well around, okay, adaptations happen within the working muscles. Obviously within boxing, we know the importance of lower body in terms of punching power, punching volume, all that kind of stuff. And so the bike kind of makes sense within that. But is there a point where, okay, even for other sports where you would need to do some form of upper body, I guess, high intensity training as well, because the adaptations, do they only happen in the legs? Are you still seeing improvements in upper body endurance, even though those muscles aren't being worked on a bike?
Interestingly, they are being worked on a bike.
Yeah.
Okay. That just threw
because
my whole theory out there.
if you think about it, when you're doing a super maximal effort, so you're going as fast as you can, you're into gripping onto the handlebars, and you start to bring your upper body into it. So actually, when we've had the Moxie monitors on the deltoids, we get a large desaturation in the deltoid much later in the sprint, but it's still there. It's occurring about 15 seconds in. As people are starting to struggle with power, they then start to bring the upper body in to try and help deliver power. So if the sprint's long enough, there'll be an upper body component to it on a bike.
And then there's the opposite way around, whereby on the arm crank, we see quite a lot of rec fem desaturation and changes and that. So you start to see that it's not as simplistic as we think, that muscles and prime movers, agonists, etc., they're all playing a role. They're all doing what they need to do, and the level of training is reflecting the type of exercise choice and everything else. I think this is where it gets quite important to actually, for people to understand what exercise they're choosing and why, and what is the rationale behind it. I mean, that's the challenge I have. I still have kids doing split squats and all that type of stuff because there's certain benefits I can get. I still have some of them shoulder press if they need it. It's not that we rule it out. It's just that C is much bigger than S for me in the world of S and C. I think strength has its place, but I think it's been overshadowed. I think conditioning's been overshadowed by strength work, and I think plyometrics is the scourge of all evil. And I think we are living in a world that is obsessed with plyometrics.
Why? What do you mean plyometrics are the scourge of all evil?
But think about it. Every time I see an Instagram a clip on a pro boxer, they've got straight leg plyo jumps before they go out and fight in a warm up, and I'm like, why would you do that? We've had athletes in that have bad knee problems, and the strength coach has got them doing crazy plyos, and you're like, why? Why the hell are you doing that? And it's because
so it's the application of the plyometrics that's the issue.
And I think this is the problem. I think we live in a shiny world, and if someone is posting something and they've got a reasonable level athlete, there's an assumption that it must be good. And I think one of the things, one of the things I always tell students is you need to be very critical of everything, especially research. More so research than anything else. Because if you've got the Scottish elite swimming team and a sample size of 10, that doesn't reflect anything in the world of combat sports. So don't use that. And I think...
the other thing about plyo is it makes people who promote plyometrics make claims that can't be substantiated. So often what you'll hear is people say you do plyometrics to increase tendon stiffness. There's no way you can measure tendon stiffness in a human. We just
no way you can measure tendon stiffness?
We can't measure what's happening in the tendon. So we're making assumptions that the tendon's getting stiffer. There's no evidence for that. The only way to actually look at that would be to take somebody's tendon out and put it on a mechanical stress test.
Yeah, and I think this is...
But we can't do that because people don't like to have tendons.
But this is the big issue within the world of sports science, is the subjective use of abstract data to propagate a theme. Post-activation potentialization, that's one of my favorites.
I think you bring this up every time we chat. It doesn't matter what we chat about. We could jump on a random call and it's like post-activation potentiation. I'm like, where'd this come
And now
from?
we've got,
It's just always on your
We're
mind.
gonna end up here again.
and now we have PAP and E in the end of it, because people have realised actually it's a lot of shite, hence PAP, because PAP's like a Glasgow word for shit. But we have coaches using this type of language that don't really understand the physiological needs of the athlete or what they're trying to achieve, but are banging out all these acronyms and things. And I'm like, we need to get back to, I hate to say this because there's a lot of old school stuff that's a bit shady, but we do need to get back to a bit more pragmatic, old school approach. You have an athlete, they're not performing X, Y, and Z. What's the skills and attributes required to make that better? And how do we build a framework using strength, conditioning, sports science to help propagate those changes? Rather than this, let's make them box jump 60 centimeters, 120 centimeters, 14 feet, flip off a box, backwards with a barbell. You know, I just think we're losing the way, and I think it's quite distressing and despairing to me at times, because you get athletes in that are really lovely kids, they come into the labs and you look at the S&C program and you're just like, holy shit, no wonder you're broken. You know, and you're just like, does your coach not know anything? And then you speak to the coach and you're just like, I'd rather staple my testicles to a table than speak to you, because it's more enjoyable. And it's just like, they don't understand muscle physiology, they don't understand systemic peripheral delivery, they don't understand how the heart works. But they're making all sorts of assumptions and claims with elite athletes. And now we're in this bad situation where we've got a lot of athletes popping for things. You know, you're seeing it more and more. Athletes are popping for drugs all the time because there's a push and a desire to get better. Whereas, you know, we shouldn't be in this state. We should be just going back to good solid principles and stop all the shiny bells and whistles and just get back to making athletes able to do the job that they're meant to be doing. Rant over.
I think sometimes we like to sound cleverer than we are.
Yeah.
So we'll use acronyms, we'll use fancy words that perhaps the general public won't understand, because it means that we look clever. And you see it a lot. Strength and conditioning has terminologies that I hate. PAP's one of them. The other one is the stretch shortening cycle. I hate that. I hate that with a passion.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as a stretch shortening cycle. It's a
Do
term
you want to dive into that?
Yes, dive in. Let's play.
It's a term that's been made up to try and describe eccentric, so muscle lengthening and shortening.
Yeah.
But the process of muscle lengthening and shortening is the same. It's not a special cycle.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
But people talk about it like it's this special cycle that's doing something marvelous, and it's not.
Mine is the ramp protocol, the Jeffries ramp protocol. That's the one that gets me all the time. Like, because warm-ups are not needed. I mean, that's the other bizarre thing that athletes have a hard time with, is I don't warm up athletes. So Hannah goes out for a fight. She might hit the pads just a few minutes before we go out, but there's no crazy warm-ups. All our athletes, no crazy, amateurs, no warm-ups. They just hit the pads for a little bit, technically to a warm-up, because the problem I've got is you see world-class athletes doing a 40-minute training session that they believe is a warm-up.
Yeah.
And that's the other big thing. And so the thing is for me is that we do all this amazing work in conditioning, and I will sit with a young coach and I will say, do not, for the life of yourself, you do not want my wrath, do not take away all my good work by making this male or female do a 90-minute warm-up before they go out and fight. And then I'll watch.
I've seen that, and
then I'll watch the idiot.
I was going to say, and doing their thing.
Yeah, and the thing is, because you've done all the hard work, all the prep, the technical, the tactical, the conditioning, they're on point, and then they go out and they are fatigued, and you're just like, why would you even? Why would you even? How can you even rationalize that in your mind in the world of high performance? That is a good thing to do, you know. And then you start looking at, you know.
I remember.
Even that hitting the pad for the athlete, it's not about warming up muscles. It's really just to get them into that psychological framework of the fight's about to start, so you better be switched on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're segueing up.
Yeah, that reminds me. In when I was working in rugby sevens, we had an Olympic qualification, and the team we were playing first, they were warming up, I think, over an hour before we were going to start a sevens match. You know, sevens is like 14
Yeah.
minutes long, and they were doing all these drills. They were on the field. They basically played a sevens match before they played us. Ended up losing, but I was just like, how could you rationalize getting out there over an hour before, and just drilling? And it was like just continuous for like an hour. I was like, fuck, like these guys must be wrecked. And then they're going to play 2 or 3 more games later that day too.
That's crazy.
It is sometimes beneficial
it's-
though. If you've got an athlete and you see it's happened to us a couple of times. We've come in and our warm up's quite late, but I see the competitor warming up like an hour and a half beforehand, and I just smile and go, excellent. Just keep warming up because I know they're
Yeah, keep going.
I'm like, you know. So it's two things.
So why would it's interesting because at least in my experience, if I don't warm up, I will hit the red line quickly, and it's hard to find that kind of like stable ground where you're kind of I don't know how you'll call it, just like that stable area where you kind of feel good and can kind of keep going without having to breathe too heavy and things like that. How do you mitigate that? Is that just done through the sprint training kind of trains that out of you where you can be able to go in cold and perform?
Anybody can go in and cold and perform. It's getting used to doing it. I think warm-ups for athletes tend to be a crutch as much as anything else. I need to warm up, I need to do this. It's almost like this is how we become elite athletes. We have to do these warm-ups. I've run 50k, rocked up, put my trainers on and ran it. I've ran marathons that way, I've ran 5Ks that way, I've ran 10Ks that way. Your body's perfectly capable of going. If it wasn't, we would be pretty easy prey for any animal that wanted to eat us. So we can move fast when we want to, we can slow it down when we want to. So I think probably that not getting into the right, finding that you're struggling to start with, is probably just you have that ingrained need. For the years that you've been doing sport, you've always warmed up.
Yeah.
So it's probably more a psychological feeling than a physiological feeling.
Did you know you can represent Sweet Science of Fighting while you're training? We're more than just a membership. We also have rash guards and shorts. If you're watching this on YouTube, you'll see that we have the Sweet Science of Fighting 2.0 shorts. And we also have the Sweet Science of Fighting short and long sleeve rash guard. There is another design coming soon, but you can get those on xmarshall.com and you can go down the description and you can find that. And back to the podcast. Interesting. Okay,
the research.
that's a nice one that goes against the grain.
Yeah, I mean, there's not a massive amount of research that really support warm-ups. You know, when you look at some of the research papers and the meta-analyses on like things like foam roll and all this stuff, you see there's not really a lot of evidence to support a lot of warm-up protocols. You kind of see it a lot, you know. So my big thing is for a boxer that's competing, they make the weight, we go out, have a nice meal, celebrate that the preparation's done. On fight day, get up, chill out. You know, the night before they made a kind of shake off, shake out, however they want to call it, wee bit of kind of pads and stuff and train. That's it. On the night of the fight, everything's done. If in the night of a fight an athlete still has to work technical work with me or has a demand and there's something not right in the camp, because at that point everything should be finished. At that point, just before they get in the fight, it should just be last minute psychological prep. Are you feeling okay? Right, let's get everything sorted. When they're wrapping the hands, that's usually it. We're ready to rock and roll. We don't need to do it now. So hit a couple of pads just for the sake of hitting a couple of pads. But a lot of times we don't even do that now. We just, you know, and we go out because the other thing is that you want the athlete when they go out to be primed and ready to go. You know, there's already a lot of obstacles at world level anyway, like national anthems from Mexico that last 3 days, and you know, like some Albanian anthem that lasts like another week. You know, so the idea of having a warm up and then having a 20-minute session in national anthems is kind of negates the whole thing anyway. So there's a lot of things you have to plan. I mean, actually, a lot of our things with a lot of high level fightings is trying to make sure there is no national anthem or there is no big long speech because we don't want it. We'd rather have that before they came out. There's a lot more to it. But warm-ups is one of these things I see quite a lot. I see more and more professional boxers doing these really crazy Ys, Ts, Vs, S-shaped things, band pulls, high pulls, plyos, pogo jumps, and I'm just like, if they're not ready, they're not ready. But they should be ready. You shouldn't, no need to do all that. And then the other thing is how is a warm up? What is the relationship of warm up to the actual skill acquisition and process that's going to take place in the sport? Is it relevant?
Hmm.
And that's
Yeah.
the other thing. I see people do things that are completely irrelevant. You know, not only just in combat sports, because I worked in a lot of other sporting fields as well. I see people do some crazy things, and you think it's got nothing to do with your sport. You know, if the aim is to increase your heart rate, just jump on the spot or skip or something. Job's done. You know, if it's a pulse raiser, because in the old days when I was a kid, it was just about pulse raisers. Everyone's like, oh, get to a pulse raiser. That was the big thing in early days
Yeah.
amateur boxing. It was going to raise the pulse. And then years later, you think, my pulse is going to be raised by the time I walk from here to the ring anyway, with adrenaline and cortisol and all that stuff. So it's a funny thing, sport. I think it's a lot more simplistic in some sides to what people think, and it's a lot more complicated in other areas than people think. And I think it's finding a happy ground between the two of them that ensures success. You know,
Yeah.
so it's quite tricky, I think. And the other thing for us as well is we talk a lot about conditioning methods and blah blah blah, but the reality for the athlete is they just get told what to do. So we just say to an athlete, "This is your protocol this week: 15 on, 10 off, or 6. Go do it." So we actually have a very hands-off relationship with athletes. So we do all the chatting when they're not there and break it all down, and I'll speak to the coach and say, "This is why we're doing this, this, and this." If it's my own athlete, they'll probably have a bit more information, but actually when it comes to drilling the protocols, it's very simple. It could just be a case I need 10 seconds on, 15 off for 6 on the bike 3 times a week, and I need you to give me a fast 5K time so I can see where you're at. And then I'll maybe have them in a bag session where if I'm looking for power, I'll be extending the time duration, so they may do 15 on, 45 seconds off, drilling specific combinations or whatever, because I maybe we're looking to improve maybe power production over time. And it could be the opposite. But we now have amateurs, which is kind of crazy, that are sparring at elite level, that are recovering 100 beats between rounds.
Dude, that's insane.
I sent you that kid's going to do it. It's like,
Yeah.
and he just went and won the Scottish there. Jimmy. The kid's got insane recovery. Well, it wasn't great when he started. But now he's got some of the best recovery I've seen. And I don't really speak to Jim that much. I just tell them what to do, because they all know they all know that I have access to their polar data, so they all know that it's getting checked. So they're all waiting for that telephone call that says, "Wait a minute, you didn't do your setting up," So
yeah. No, I mean, we want to. I mean, you still got to bloody clear it with your university, Andrew. I mean, we want to release some kind of bespoke conditioning on here for sure, using your stuff and make you some cash too at the same time. But obviously, you got to clear that with the university. But I wanted, before going down more practical side of this too, there was a paper that came out. I'm going to butcher this so bad, so I hope you know which one you're talking. You know what I'm talking about here, John. But something about high intensity conditioning increasing, I think it was arterial stiffness, and the idea of that more people should be doing lower intensity conditioning over higher intensity because of that. This is more general population stuff. I don't know if you have any insight into that. Or
Did see that one. I think it was a review. What we've found is in elderly, sprints reduce arterial stiffness.
Okay.
And aid flow. And what was his name? Robert, part of a guy at Hamilton. Marty Gabala's group at Hamilton.
Yes.
Again showed arterial stiffness reduced in young people as well.
Okay.
So it may be the modality, that was with cycle-based Wingate sprinting. So it may be the modality of sprinting that was used in.
Interesting.
But from the stuff I've seen on papers that have actually measured it, is it reduces arterial stiffness because you get endothelial remodeling. So I think the blood vessels are made up of endothelial cells. The high stress of a high blood flow from sprinting, having that really quick early onset heart rate and pushing through a lot of blood, promotes remodeling very quickly of the
Gotcha.
vasculature, so it then relaxes more, and they become more responsive to things like nitric oxide and relax more.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. And then as well, before going into the more practical side as well, this idea of high intensity training, I guess the reason it's not poo-pooed, but kind of used maybe later on in training, and the aerobic or lower intensity side is, I guess, prioritized. It's the idea that, okay, we do these high intensity sprints, we raise blood lactate. By raising blood lactate in association, we raise hydrogen ions, other acidic byproducts and things. And these byproducts may have a negative effect on mitochondria in terms of mitochondrial density, etc., etc. Is there anything to this? Is this something that happens? It sounds like from what you're doing, you're actually improving mitochondrial function because you're targeting peripheral adaptations. So I guess where does this come from? Do you know where this comes from? Is this something to worry about? Is this something that happens?
It probably comes from fatigue literature, from the same sort of literature that suggests hydrogen ions causes fatigue and stops muscle contracting. If you actually look at these papers, they're all done at 5 degrees centigrade. Human muscle is 37 degrees.
Okay.
There was a group in Japan about 7 years ago who repeated it at 5 degrees, and at 30 degrees they couldn't take it to 37. They took it to 30 degrees, and at 30 degrees centigrade, hydrogen ions had no impact on muscle function whatsoever. But at 5 degrees they did.
Interesting.
So I don't believe hydrogen ions are a major issue. I think probably a more, in terms of fatigue, there's an ionic imbalance around sodium and potassium that impacts the ability to release calcium. So I don't think the hydrogen ions are necessarily a problem. Lactate's not a problem. Lactate is a fuel. It's just a fuel source. You either use it or you don't use it. If you don't use it, your body transports it somewhere else, and somewhere else uses it. So having high lactate's never an issue. It just shows your conditioning's probably not right, and you're over-relying on anaerobic glycolysis during what you were doing. Gotcha. So I'm not sure if I answered your question.
No, it does that. I mean, I'm gonna I literally have to overhaul everything that I've ever read, I swear, after this podcast and try to digest all this. But the other thing I know Andrew always loves to go down the road on is energy systems. And we're going to touch on this before we go into the practical stuff, because you keep bringing up things in my head. The idea of energy systems, the idea of, okay, we know that all three energy systems work together regardless of what we do.
Yep.
But maybe some are preferentially used during, or intensity dictates what is used preferentially. But I guess the idea is, I don't even know what my question is here on energy systems, but it's just the idea that should we even bother to think about energy systems when we're doing conditioning? That would be my question there. Because a lot of stuff you're doing sprint interval training, you're looking at outputs. So is energy systems even in your mind when doing this stuff?
So no, not really. I mean, I think the issue I have with energy systems is it's become a very nice industry earner to create training programs and modalities for doing, but the reality is you need aerobic, you need anaerobic, you need all these things, physiologically. There's a chicken and egg story with mitochondria, because in order to kind of oxidative phosphorylation, and non-oxidative pathways, you need to have certain oxygen first present in order to get through those pathways. So oxygen is always present, and if the oxygen isn't present, then obviously we're hitting, cellular death. So I think I understand why in the early days, it was easy to go, the first 6 seconds you're utilizing phosphocreatine, blah, 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 blah. And I get that from a training point of view, from an education point of view, but I think the problem was that conditioning coaches and strength coaches ran away with it in a very simplistic model. And I think this has been the big issue. And I think, the reality is if you play around with nerves, you start into a big rabbit hole of, well, why is this aerobic? Why is this anaerobic? If oxygen is always present in the muscle tissue, unless, you're in really severe fatigue states. So I always say to students and stuff, understand the energy systems model that's presented in textbooks, because it's good to know, but the reality is practically it's never going to be like that. Everything's firing off at the same time. Intensity is just using different substrates. The goal should just be for the athlete to perform it in the domain that they're working in. You should not specifically be training an athlete to be predominantly aerobic or predominantly anaerobic. You should not have people holding their breath running, telling them they're training anaerobically, because they're not. And I still see that in this day and age, and that blows my mind that I can go to gyms and kids are like this, running round the room, and the coach is going, we're doing anaerobic training. I just go, no. I mean, but it's not the coach's fault. That's what they've been told by maybe a national coaching body, you know,
Yeah.
by someone that doesn't have any physiology knowledge either, but has learnt it from someone else and has maybe somebody's had a bit of banter with them and they've taken it as being real. And it's a crazy world. So when I'm training athletes now, I don't really think of energy systems as much. I'm just looking at physiological response. So I'm looking at how they're
Yeah.
recovering, what's the time to recovery, is it a slow fast phase recovery, how quick can they get into fast phase recovery? That's all I'm interested in. I don't think you need to go out and do. I mean, the only time so here's the thing. So this steady state occurs naturally anyway, because people don't train hard enough. So most people that are doing training sessions are pretty steady state anyway. So
Yeah.
that aerobic development that everyone's claiming is just happening as a byproduct of just day-to-day life for a lot of people. So I don't spend a lot of time that. Occasionally with cyclists maybe coming back from injury. I have a lot of downhillers that get pretty mashed up and they're a wee bit fear reactive and things. I've seen it with snowboarders as well. A lot of times we will do lower volume training, is what I now call it, rather than zone 2. I don't have them try and keep their heart rate between 120 and 160 beats. That's another one of these crazy fallacies that breaks my heart, you know, because I just seen it today. I sent John something today about a conditioning school doing heart rate zoning in 5 zones, and I just looked at their zoning and I thought, well, how do you know? Because you haven't done any type of testing to do fat max, and you've not done any testing to do VO2 max testing, you've not done step testing. How can you say that's somebody's zones? You know,
And how can you say at 69% it's this, but at 70% it's this?
yeah, yeah. So
It's the same thing
How
with
is your
velocity-based
body
training,
able
right?
to so finitely identify that change in intensity
yeah,
that it's going to flip to something completely different?
and so the other big thing is there's a big
For
push.
sure.
There's a big push for this to happen. So you're seeing kids buy VO2 masters, Pinoys, and all that type of stuff, right? And this is kind of interesting as well. You know, for example, VO2 master obviously doesn't have a CO2 sensor, so it can't do gas exchange, so it can't tell you substrate. So the RMR is also fixed at 0.85 because that's how they use the system. So boxers should be doing RMR testing on that anyway, because if they're in any kind of weight cut, you're not getting a true reflection. But we get kids banging out these reports at 250 quid a pop. You get kids using Pinoy, which is probably, in my experience, having owned one, the most unstable, unreliable piece of kit on the market. It's a gas analyzer. And then you have the issue that even in the lab, the Cortex, you'd have 2 Cortexes side by side and they'll have 2 different readings. They'll be out 7% error rate margin. So we live in a world of
Wow.
abstract values, nothing. But yet in the world of nutrition and sports nutrition, these kids can go, URMR is 1192 because the machine tells me it's 1192. And I show this to students all the time because we'll take an RMR on the Cortex because we're writing a nice Python app that'll run it. And then I'll show all the different mathematical formulas and we'll look at, you know, the spread, you know, and to say that the Cortex is the gold standard and giving you the closest result, it's not true. And I'll also say these kids, and the other thing is you need to remember is physiology is dictated by on the day. So it is what it is on the day, but it doesn't mean tomorrow it's going to be exactly the same because we're a living system. So, you know, so it's a crazy world, you know. So so when you dive into energy systems and you look at all these things, RMR is very difficult to really get accurate. It's just a, you know, best fit on the day, and everything else. You think, well, how can you be training someone? It's, you know, a heart rate.
For me, energy systems are important to understand more from a kinetic model because it helps explain kinetically what's happening in the body.
Yeah.
To train based on energy systems is a fallacy. If you do 2 hours of steady state running, you will be using phosphocreatine, you'll have some anaerobic glycolysis, and you'll have some aerobic metabolism. So you'll be using them all, and they will be adapting to that stress to deliver the performance benefits that you see from doing that type of training.
Mm.
So the energy system's always getting used. It's how different training systems will utilize them differently. So sprint will have a very high breakdown of glycogen, which allows supercompensation of glycogen to occur in recovery. So they do different things, but for training an athlete, it's not important. What's important is, are you creating muscular efficiency?
But then you get conditioning coaches and S&C coaches that don't actually go to training sessions, right? And this blows my mind. So years ago, in my younger days, if I took on a tennis player as a client, I would go and do the level 1 national coaching course, because I'd want to know, what do the coaches actually need as skills and attributes before I actually coach this person. And then I'd come back and I would go, okay, did we go, went to the TPI courses and all that stuff, and went and get lessons with PGA Pro, because I wanted to know before I coached this lad just exactly are the skills that the coach is going to be requesting, so that when I did his S&C programming, I could marry it all together. But you have a massive world of nutritionists that think they're S&C coaches, attend, rock up when the kid gets the belt, but I've never attended a training session. I don't actually know what the volume of work is, or how much effort the kid's going. Are they doing round robin sparring? Are they not doing round robin? Is it a bag day? Is it a pad day? And then I formulate an S&C program that are completely uncoordinated to the actual outcome of the athlete. Because we just seem to think that plyos is going to do this, this is going to do this, bench is going to do this, this is going to do this. But my argument since my early 30s, and I'm 50 now, has always been, go learn the sport. Doing the sport makes you better at the sport. The S&C is just to make you do the sport a little bit better. So at the very least, go and spend some time in the sporting domain and have a look at it. You don't need to be amazing at it, but you need to have a little bit of an understanding of the sport. But more so, what I find now is people are so, we don't do, say in the UK, we don't do multidisciplinary teamwork. Okay, I've worked overseas and it's a lot more combined. The team will get together and sit and go, what's on the board this week, who's doing what, okay, where are they at, what's this been done? But generally over here, it's not like that. So the S&C don't really have any participation in, say, sparring sessions or technical sessions, so they don't really know what occurs. And I think we need to go back to a much more multidisciplinary understanding. I think that is when we're going to get the best athletes. The best athletes I work with, I'm just part of a team. I do my job. I feedback the shit that I need to feedback. Somebody else feedback, this is what happened. Somebody, the nutritionist will feedback, this is what I'm planning, this is what's happening here. Those are the best teams. Everyone with individual bits of relevance and experience. A lot of times we cross over experience-wise, but everyone's got a role. But at the moment, it seems to be everything's about Instagram-like, and it's the wild, wild west of training. And we're losing track. At the end of the day, our job is to make the athlete successful. That's our job. Our job is not to be in the ring holding the belts and swanning around like we're Muhammad Ali. That's not our job. It drives me nuts, this.
Correct.
I'll be at shows and, I hate being filmed at the best times, and you have some nutrition guy that you've never heard of is rocked up and he wants his photographs, and you're like, who the bloody hell are you? So I was instrumental to the success of this athlete. Like, really? I've never seen you at a single training session. How can you be instrumental?
The other thing with S&C is it's very much at the moment a one size fits all. So S&C coaches don't tend to think outside the box. I've done my NASCA, my UKSCA, whatever. To improve strength, I've got to do this. To improve this, I've got to do that. I've got to do that. I've got to do that. And it's very. This is the only way you can do it. I think. It's perhaps a problem with how we train S&C coaches.
For sure.
We don't allow uncertainty to come in. This is the way you have to do it. But actually, not everyone responds to the same type of exercise. You may need to adjust it slightly. Some people may need something slightly different.
I think that's...
Well, that was... Oh, yeah, you go, Andrew.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think that one of probably the big things I see at the moment is the lack of progression and regression in exercise selection for a lot of athletes. I mean, I don't do as much S&C now as I do physiology. It's mostly physiology. I still do for some athletes the whole, everything from nutrition right through, right? Because I'm qualified to do that. That's the other thing. Do within what you're qualified to do. That's one of the other big things that kind of cracks me up a lot of times, that people are not actually qualified to do what they're doing. But anyway, it's a different subject. But a lot of times you get athletes who come in and it's like they maybe have a good strength and conditioning coach who's generally quite good, but doesn't know how to do regressions and doesn't know how to step things back a little bit. That's a big issue at the moment. There seems to be this need to always push forward. There seems to be less going back to, right, that's not working for you. You don't have stability in the ankle, so we're not going to load you up. We're going to go back to just single leg work. There seems to be a lack of that at times, which I think is, I mean, we're in a lucky position because our S&C program is getting changed around quite a lot at the uni. So if anyone's listening, it's in the whole Scotland area, wants to learn really good applied science and applied strength conditioning, Abertay is your place. It's a shameless plug out the way.
Shameless
Nice.
plug.
I mean, because I think about our uni is we're obsessed with applied science. So I think that's probably the big difference for us, is that we are very theoretical at the postgraduate side, what we do, but it's all about how do we actually apply it in real time, in a context, because I think is the missing value a lot of times. I think that's why you see a lot of crazy programming and people trying to use research to back it up without them actually having went and read the research paper. They maybe read the abstract, and you know what I mean, but haven't actually read the methods or anything else, and you think, that's it.
Yeah.
But going back to the original question, energy systems, yes, I think train the athlete for what they need to do, be less obsessed with lactic, alactic training systems, and exception would be if I did have an athlete that had a very high resting heart rate, 100 plus, then I probably would look to do, I guess you may call it cardiac output training, something along those kind of lines, just to but I'd also be looking to do intensity-based work as well, but I'd be wanting to get both sides of the coin kind of happening relatively quick. I wouldn't necessarily want to have them doing 120 to 160 beats, 3 times a week at 4 hours a session, 12 hours a week for the next 10 weeks, because I'd be thinking I need to escalate that. And the other thing is, I don't know who works with athletes that have that luxury anyway. I don't have that luxury. My athletes come in broken and I've got 3 weeks to get them to a world championship state. It's like, John will tell you the stress. This is why I'm balding and going grey. The amount of stuff that happens. You're like, okay, I'm fighting next week. Really? It's like a firefighting job. It's like, can you actually get this athlete to the position that they're going to be capable of doing the job? Are the parents on board if it's a young athlete to support what needs to be done? I mean, one of the big issues I have at the moment is trying to persuade a lot of athletes to go up in weight rather than killing themselves going down the way. So I don't know who has the luxury of doing like these 12-week zone 2 programs, because the athletes that tend to work with.
Yeah, I've seen a few of those come out now.
Yeah, 12-week program, zone 2. And you let's increase your drop your resting heart rate from 70 to 56. I'm like, wow, okay. So yeah, I'm very skeptical of a lot of things now, I think, because I think, I'm not going to throw anyone under the bus, but there's a few people made a good name for themselves in the world of conditioning with very old dated thought processes and physiology, and don't seem to have any moved forward or done any deep learning, and we can all cherry pick research. I mean, yourself, James, it's super easy to cherry pick research. It's like you can go out PubMed and be a bit of confirmation bias, and before you know it, you're making golfers swing at 3,000 miles per hour because 3 papers said it was possible. So I am always very super cautious. For me, it's about results driven. It's about, are your athletes actually doing what you're trying to get them to do? Is the outcomes there? And also when you lose and it doesn't happen, that's sometimes the more exciting bit, because then you get that reflection period where you think, well, what didn't actually occur and how do we fix that? I think that's one of the bits that is probably least understood in the world of sports science as well, is like when it goes wrong. And it does go wrong, and how do you fix it? It's like, it can go wrong. It's kind of like, it's just not went the way it wants it to go. So
yeah.
But yeah.
Well, let's bring this practical for the listeners to finish this out. Okay, so let's say someone, they don't have access to your Python scripts, algorithms, the way to interpret it, your flywheel, your ergometer bike. They have none of that. They have, say, a spin bike and a heart rate monitor. Where do they start, and what do they do in terms of this high intensity training? How do they progress it? All of that.
So I would say,
I'll-
let John do it because John's the expert. So
So with a spin bike, it's super easy. On a 30-second sprint, your heart rate should be getting up to about 160 beats per minute on the first sprint. So around about your peak
and
heart rate.
that's from cold, like your heart
Yeah.
rate
Yeah.
is pretty much okay. Yeah.
Then what you want to do is look at the heart rate data across the sprint session. You don't need to run the maths. All you need to do is look at shapes.
yeah,
Shapes. So how is that heart rate dropping? Is it going straight down, or is there a big delay and then it starts to drop? When it's dropping, is it dropping really sharp, or is it slow, a slower slope? And then when does it plateau out? When does it hit a steady state? And does it move on from that steady state, or are you stuck in that when you do your next sprint session? So it's really look at shapes and again on the onside, how quickly is the heart rate going on? How quickly are you getting up there? What's the shape of it getting up? It should be a slight delay, very fast, and then into a steady state.
Okay.
so get a
Do
friend.
you have anything to add to that, Andrew?
Yeah, so get a friend, okay, that can turn the dial, the resistance on the spin bike, okay, because this is the hardest bit. So find what feels comfortably uncomfortable for sprint, okay, and get your friend to turn it so there's no resistance, so that you kind of just warm your legs up a little bit, and then just gradually increase that to a comfortable level, and then as you start to all out sprint, get them just to jam that knob up a few steps to give you more resistance, and that's going to give you as close to the load bike or like a decent bike experience, because you really need someone to ideally to dial in. If you don't, you just set a setting that you want, and you're just going to go all out. You're going to sprint like people have broken into your house and chasing you, or maybe debt collectors are coming for their money, just whatever. You're just going to sprint like crazy, and then you're going to stop and you're going to repeat it. And that is going to be the base of your sprint. It should not be easy. It should feel like you.
Yeah.
And don't do it upstairs. Ideally, do it in a bungalow or somewhere where there's no change of levels. Because if you do this,
I've made that mistake.
yeah, if you do it properly, it will be horrific. But it will pass relatively sure. So, and that's the best way. And when you get your data, it's like John said, it's like you want to look at the shapes. It's almost like an upside down U, but wider. You know, a good sprint will come up and it'll come down. It'll come up and come down. If you're starting off, it's not going to be like that. The heart rate's going to go up. You might get a wee tiny drop, then it's going to go up, and it's going to drop, and it's going to go up, and it's going to drop. And you're going to see that.
That was me.
Yeah, and you're going to see then that you're not recovering. So there's no real recovery there, and you got maybe a bit of cardiac drift or whatever. But as your sprints get better, you'll start to see that you'll start to follow these kind of mountains. You'll start to go up, you'll go down, you go up, you'll go down, and that'll be telling you that your recovery is getting much better. And at that point, then things get changed.
And the one thing we know you can play around with to really change the adaptation you're getting is how much recovery you give yourself between each sprint. So that is one variable where we know if we play around with that, if we reduce it, we can really drive aerobic adaptations. If we increase it, you can really start to drive power adaptations.
Yeah.
And the ratio is quite simple.
I did some bike sprints.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So basically,
from what I was reading, it was 1 to 8 ratio, right? Work to rest.
Kind of, yeah. So basically,
1 to 8, 1 to 6 is the way to get the best of both worlds. But if you're really looking to push the recovery, you want to bring that work to rest ratio right down.
Yeah. So if you want recovery, smaller. If it's heart rate recovery, you're looking for a smaller recovery between sprints. If you're looking to generate maybe more power, longer recovery. And that makes sense, right? Because if you're going to produce power, you want kind of glycogen resynthesis, you want all that kind of stuff to happen, so you want to have a bit more on the muscle. So this is where it gets really nice for Muay Thai, MMA, boxers, is that, you know, a lot of times if we get kids that we want to work really specific combinations for an upcoming fight, what we'll do is we will go interval it. So if we want a lot more power on the shots, I've got some athletes that maybe we need a bit more power. A lot of times we'll have them do very explosive combinations for like 10 on, and then we'll just give them 40 off, and then we'll go 10 on, 40 off, and we'll do that for the round duration. So we'll do that for a 3-minute round over 6 rounds, and we start to build that. Others, it could be we need more recovery, so we'll have them work the bag, the top bottom ball, wherever, and be 15 on, 15 off, a 1-to-1 ratio. and they'll do that for 3 minutes, 60-second recovery, 3 minutes, and they just start to build. And a lot of it is feel. You'll know because most of our athletes and amateurs, I'll go, "How was the session today?" And it'll just be abuse. They'll give me. They'll just be like, "Yeah, you're just the most satanic person on the planet. I don't really, you know." So, and most weeks are like that for them, in fairness. You know, and they'll tell you, they'll know how hard it was. A good athlete will be honest about how hard it was. You know, if you get an athlete that everything's okay, that you have a problem because they're not really being honest. One of the key things is they need to really be honest. That's where the heart rate data helps, because if you can have access to the heart rate data, and you can, if you're a coach, this is a good tip for coaches. If you're a coach and you have everyone on the Polar H10, then you can access their data through the coach system, which is free in Polar. So there's a Polar coach option. That's what I use. And you can add your athletes to it. They just accept the invite. Then you will have all their data. So you can then look at the data. So what I do on a Sunday's data day for me. So Sundays, when I go through everyone's heart rate data, I usually do a Wednesday. I actually should say this: Wednesdays, Mondays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays. Everyone is your heart rate data day. So I don't want them just thinking I'm only checking a Sunday. But Sunday's the main day where I tend to look at all the data, and I will just take the week's trends and I'll look at it. And it doesn't cost any. You know, you don't need to buy these crazy app systems that a lot of companies are using to add your athletes to. I use the Polar platform, have done, doesn't cost a single penny. I can access the data, I can download the data. It's really, really good. And that's a really good way of just tracking your athletes and having a glance and going, once you get into this and you start to understand what heart rate should look like, you can spot it really fast. You can just see all the time. You know, and you can feed it back to your athletes and go, recovery wasn't too good that session. You know. And the big thing for me,
and I think as the person doing the sprints too, like I've done a few of them for you as well with the heart rate data, and I know one of them I was like, I don't think I got the resistance right, because I didn't get that same feeling as the one when I was absolutely completely fucked. My quads, I couldn't walk, I was lightheaded, I lay on the floor, my quads were still sore for like 5 minutes. Man, it was so painful.
That's right.
That was the most painful I've been in a sprint. Like my quads were so pumped, I was like, damn, I just like almost like I did 10 sets of squats, and I had massive legs, and I was like, that's pretty sweet, but it hurts so bad. It's so bad.
It's a funny thing because we talk about this quite a lot, and we joke a lot with athletes when they come for athletic testing days. So we do obviously the bike sprint, but we do the upper body sprint as well, and we usually either the bike or the upper body is going to be the nemesis. Okay, but we have quite gung-ho kids come in and stuff, and then it isn't too long before they're vomiting out the back door, and they're like, that is so hard. Because I think a lot of times, and it goes back to what John was saying earlier on, a lot of times athletes don't push themselves hard enough. So when they're doing their sprint sessions or they're doing the conditioning sessions, they don't really know what super maximal really feels like. But when you're in the lab or you've got a good coach that can push you to that level, it's a completely different feeling. And you need to feel it, I think, to be able to then repeat it. Because see, once you can feel it and you can repeat it, that's when you get crazy adaptations really, really quick. And obviously, we should probably quickly touch on it, that the adaptations we're trying to create is a much bigger, I guess, capillary density, probably more oxygen to come in, but also mitochondria. So we're looking to build more mitochondria in order to produce more adenosine triphosphate and energy. So that's why we're doing the sprints predominantly. It's there because we're looking to get that physiology change to allow better energy system management, better oxygenation, and just generally better performance and better recovery metrics. That's why we do it.
And for fighters listening, we're talking these super maximal sprints that are only say 10 minutes long. The intensity or the way it feels should feel harder than the hard sparring sessions.
Yeah. So if you think about it and you look at the data of punches thrown per round and these sort of things, it's not high volume and actually highly competitive fights. You know, there's not a lot being thrown. So it should feel much harder. It should be a leg burning, arm crunching. The first one will feel pretty bad. 2 and 3, if you're unfortunate to be made do 3, but 2 will feel pretty grim. 2 will feel like you've not recovered from the first one, and that's the aim.
That's two 30-second ones, right?
Yeah. So I would normally every athlete remotely, I'd probably do 230s twice a week for the first 2 weeks, unless they're really game and they want to do 3. But normally I go, just give me 2, and that's the benchmark. After 2 weeks of that, I'd look at that if it's a remote client, then I'd analyse the data and I'd say, right, okay, now we're going to move into this. If after 2 weeks I don't feel there's a lot of change, I can't see any change, I maybe continue it for another week and do a maximum of 3 at the 30 seconds. But usually after the second week, we're looking to change it up. But I'm looking to then what I'm doing is speaking to them about what is it they want, and then I usually speak to their coach and ask, what is it you need? And if the coach is telling me, for example, I'm just not fast enough out the gate, I just don't engage quick enough, then I will look to create a protocol around about that. If it's like they just seem to be dipping in the third round, they just don't seem to be, or in the fifth round they're just totally fatigued, I will change protocols around about that. Okay, and that's because that's the important part. Because at the end of the day, you're going to get your physiological adaptation with your sprint, which is fine. But there's a lot of other nuances you can get from it. Like, for example, you can get peak activation much quicker. You can get them pushing out quicker, or you can get them recovering better. You can play around with it. As I said earlier, with Hannah, the big thing for us is we wanted her on the last bite there with Lauren Hollars to engage right off the bat. I wanted her walking out and hitting, walking out and hitting. I didn't want her standing in the middle, sizing her up. Just wanted front foot, bang. And we drilled that specifically on the bike sprints. So that's why we changed the weight ratio. So we started adding 8.5% in the flywheel, then up to 9.5%, because we wanted that push, that real drive.
Gotcha.
And we've seen her peak times come down from like 4.5 seconds down to like just under 1 second. So she had a massive shift in that.
Wow.
Okay, and then we repeated that on the bag. So then we went to the bag session. It's the same thing. We took her boxing coach, Noel Callan, took her slightly further away from the bag. Then we had her just walk to the bag, move the bag, and hit, boom, straight away. And then we did it in sparring. Then we get top quality sparring partners in, same thing. As soon as you come out the corner, boom, straight into it, because that's what we're looking to develop. In the previous camp, it was slightly different. In the previous camp, we just wanted recovery between rounds. So that rest component was really important. And we started to, in between sparring sessions, we took it down to 30-second recovery. Even in spar sessions, and the bag was the same. We just shortened it down because we're getting that adaptation of heart rate recovery. When you're pushing for impulse, you're looking to generate maximum amount of power straight away. And the other thing is her resistance training for the camp effectively was the bike at a higher weight in the K-box.
Yeah.
And all that.
Oh, nice.
That was basically it in the 300-pound heavy bag. Arrival 300-pound heavy bag. At the end of the camp, that thing was swinging all over the place. She was hitting with so much power. And that's to me is how you get the best of both worlds. You get very specific conditioning, very specific physiological adaptation, but it relates in an applied context. If you're doing sprints for the sake of sprints and you don't see the results in sparring and combat sports as your discipline, there's something wrong. You're not training the sprints to appropriately match what the outcome is. And my thing is always boxers need to be able to box, and everything we're doing is to allow them to box better. So all of the stuff we're doing, the S&C and everything is there to see the benefits in sparring, because that's the closest resemblance to the expression of the sport is sparring other than competition. So I need to see it in sparring. So I need to see the stuff we're working on. So if an S&C coach is working with us, I need to see it in sparring. I need to see what he's been doing or she's been doing with the athlete. I need to see it in sparring. I need to see what I'm doing. I need to see it in sparring. And for me, that's where working with good coaches or being a coach yourself, you can see it. You can go, right, I'm getting this quicker off. I'm getting this push off the foot more. Hips coming through a bit more positioning. The recovery of the hips good. Glenohumeral joints coming in play a lot better. Scapula's in the right position. I'm seeing the extension. This is how it all comes together. So it's sprints, not only for physiological adaptation, but for performance as well. And that's probably something we don't explain enough. A lot of people think we're just doing these sprints for the sake of sprints. We're not. There's a lot of stuff that we now look at that we never used to look at, like time to peak power, how it's been maintained, minimal values, rate of force development, all that type of stuff. You can get a lot more out of a Wingate than the research will let you believe. There's a whole heap of interesting stuff. And you can get it off of other things. If you've got a concept bike or a watt bike, we'll get an issue with the watt bike, but you've got to get... The problem with the watt bike is what we've found, and I've got my own one next door, is I don't think the power readings are as accurate as they think. Because we've had a lot of problems. Because, for example, Hannah's hitting the watt bike, and she's remotely in London, and I'm obviously up in Scotland, and she's hitting 600, 700 watts, and I'm like, she should be banging out 1200 on that thing. And then she comes to the lab, and she's bumping out close to 1000, and you start to go, there's an issue with that watt bike.
Yeah.
So a good watt bike that's calibrated is worth its weight in gold. But the Concept 2 bike also gives power as well. So even though they're not 100% accurate, they're extra nice little metrics to have if you can get them. So if you're at a pure gym, or if you're in a boxing gym and you get a spin bike, it's fine. But if you've got a gym membership and that place has a watt bike or a Concept 2 bike that has a watt reading on it, use that one, because you're going to get some nice metrics about how quick are you getting to your wattage and how does that relate to how you're feeling. So there's a lot of really super nice data you can get, which is pretty easy to analyze.
Oh, perfect. I think that's the perfect way to finish this podcast too. An hour and a half of knowledge bombs throughout this. But for people listening, John, where can they find and follow your research? And same with you, Andrew. But John, you go first.
I'm actually really bad on social media. So my research will be on PubMed, university web pages. I'm very poor at self-promotion of my research, so I don't tend to post on social media very often.
Okay, we're gonna have to help promote your research then on Sweet Science of Fighting for sure. I need to keep going through that. And Andrew, where can they find you?
I'm not that prolific either on socials, but I'm on social. So the Andrew Usher for Twitter, and I think the Andrew Usher for Instagram. I've not really been posting that much because we're really busy with a few papers that we're trying to finish off and get published. And then we're obviously prepping Hannah for our next fight with Emma Cozen in September. So we're quite busy at the moment. So, but you can get me there. I'm on the university RQE research thingy-jiggy that I never pay much attention to, but I'm on that.
Yep.
Or people can just find me at combatsportperformance.com. I'm floating around. If people have any questions, I'm more than happy to email me. I do now have a very strong enforced spam filter for all the abuse that I occasionally get, so it will not get through now. So yes, and hopefully soon. I'm obviously thinking. I'm being thrown around, as you know, I've been throwing around the idea of writing a course for quite some time, and I'm a bit closer to thinking that maybe the time is right to put together something that's a bit more modern, a bit more a bit more accessible for people and how we do things, because there's probably a lot of things that we do that are actually probably easier to do than how I explain them. So a course might be the best way of actually doing that. And I like the idea of maybe creating a course as a toolset app that allows people to run exponential data and teach them, the details of sports science and how you actually apply it. So I'm hoping maybe later this year to really thrash that out. Have a chat with yourself about that as well, and put something nice together that, because we have a very good track record at the moment. We're just not very good at publicising. The only time we publicise it is if, for example, a big name fighters in and suddenly BBC Scotland television or Sky's in, and then we get a bit of a hoorah around what we're doing. But generally, I think that's the thing, is we're not secretive in the sense that we talk a lot and stuff and ramble shite enough. But I am too busy to be on Instagram posting what I had for breakfast and what Hannah had for breakfast and the amount of macros that were in that and how much potassium was in it and how that enabled her to jump 19 feet. So I'm way too busy for that, but I'm around, so if anyone needs any.
Yep. Andrew's also in the Discord too for any Sweet Science of Fighting Underground members, so he's in there too if anyone wants to ask questions as well. But we'll end this live stream here, and if anyone's wanting to ask questions from the community, feel free to. But thanks for coming on, guys.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
Thanks a lot.